The Euromissile crisis did not begin with protests in the streets or missiles on launchers, but with a quiet shift in the balance of fear inside Europe during the mid-1970s, when the Cold War's nuclear logic moved from abstract deterrence to an immediate lived reality for hundreds of millions of civilians, because for the first time since the early Cold War, the central battlefield of nuclear escalation was no longer imagined as a distant superpower exchange, but as a compressed, time-critical confrontation centered directly on European soil, where warning times were measured in minutes and political decisions could no longer be separated from instant annihilation. At the heart of this shift was the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile, a mobile solid-fuel system capable of striking targets across Western Europe with unprecedented speed and accuracy, fundamentally altering the strategic environment by decoupling European security from American territory, as these missiles could devastate NATO capitals without immediately threatening the continental United States, raising the terrifying possibility that Europe could be destroyed in a nuclear exchange that Washington might hesitate to escalate into full intercontinental war. For European leaders, this development triggered a profound strategic anxiety because the credibility of extended deterrence, the promise that the United States would risk its own cities to defend its allies, suddenly felt less certain when nuclear war could be fought and potentially contained within Europe alone. This fear was not theoretical, but rooted in Cold War planning assumptions that had evolved since the Cuban Missile Crisis, as both superpowers increasingly sought options that limited escalation while preserving leverage, a logic that paradoxically made nuclear war more thinkable rather than less. NATO's response emerged slowly and unevenly, shaped by internal disagreement, public denial, and an effort to avoid panic, as alliance planners debated whether the SS-20 represented a genuine imbalance or merely a modernization of existing Soviet capabilities, even as intelligence assessments warned that the psychological and political impact of the missiles mattered as much as their raw numbers. By the late 1970s, it became clear that the issue could no longer be managed quietly, because the Soviet advantage in intermediate-range nuclear forces threatened to undermine NATO cohesion by driving wedges between American and European interests, encouraging neutralism, and feeding public skepticism about nuclear deterrence itself. The alliance's answer took shape in 1979 with the so-called dual-track decision, a strategy that combined an offer of arms control negotiations with a commitment to deploy new U.S. intermediate-range missiles in Europe if talks failed, an approach designed to restore balance while preserving diplomatic cover, yet one that immediately exposed the fragility of consensus inside democratic societies, increasingly unwilling to accept nuclear weapons in their midst. The proposed deployments included the Pershing II ballistic missile and the ground-launched cruise missile, systems that dramatically shortened warning times and heightened first-strike fears, particularly the Pershing II, whose speed and accuracy meant it could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes, compressing decision-making to a point where misinterpretation or technical error could trigger catastrophe before leaders even understood what was happening. This compression of time represented a qualitative shift in Cold War risk, transforming deterrence from a relatively stable standoff into a hair-trigger environment in which human judgment was increasingly subordinate to automated systems and pre-delegated authority. Across Western Europe, the prospect of hosting these weapons ignited a political and moral crisis, as governments faced the impossible task of reassuring populations that nuclear deployments were necessary for peace, while acknowledging that those same weapons made their cities prime targets in the event of war. Mass movements emerged not as abstract ideological protests, but as expressions of existential fear, as millions of ordinary citizens concluded that the logic of deterrence had failed to protect them, and instead placed them directly in the crosshairs of superpower rivalry. In West Germany, the central geographic and symbolic battleground of the crisis, memories of past destruction collided with the realization that the country had become the primary nuclear buffer between East and West, a role that required accepting annihilation as a strategic necessity rather than an avoidable tragedy. The Soviet Union watched these developments with a mixture of concern and opportunity, interpreting NATO's internal divisions as evidence that Western resolve could be fractured through pressure and propaganda, and launching its own political campaign to portray the missile deployments as aggressive escalation rather than defensive response, even as it continued to expand and modernize its own arsenal. This information war blurred the line between peace activism and geopolitical manipulation, complicating public debate and deepening mistrust, as intelligence agencies on both sides sought to influence opinion while maintaining plausible deniability. Behind the scenes, military planners confronted an even darker reality, that the Euromissile Crisis had created a situation in which any conventional conflict in Europe risked rapid nuclear escalation, because the presence of short warning systems incentivized preemption and reduced confidence in crisis stability. War games and classified assessments repeatedly showed that escalation ladders collapsed under pressure, as commanders faced overwhelming incentives to use or lose nuclear forces before they were destroyed, a logic that rendered the distinction between defense and offense meaningless. By the early 1980s, as deployments loomed and negotiations stalled, Europe entered one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, not marked by visible confrontation or dramatic showdowns, but by a pervasive sense of vulnerability, as populations lived under the knowledge that decisions made in distant capitals could erase entire societies in minutes, and that the weapons designed to protect them had instead made them hostages to a strategy no one fully controlled. The Euromissile Crisis thus represented a turning point in Cold War history, when nuclear deterrence ceased to feel remote or abstract and became an immediate condition of daily life, exposing the fundamental tension at the heart of the Cold War system, that stability depended on weapons whose very presence made catastrophe possible at unprecedented speed, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test not only military balance, but the political and psychological limits of nuclear deterrence itself. As the Euromissile Crisis moved from strategic debate into lived political reality, the fault lines it exposed within Western Europe widened into a full-scale legitimacy crisis for Cold War governance. Because the decision to deploy new nuclear systems was not merely a military adjustment, but a profound test of whether democratic societies could consent to strategies that openly accepted their own destruction as a prerequisite for stability. Nowhere was this tension more acute than in West Germany, where geography, history, and alliance obligation converged to make the country both the primary beneficiary and the principal victim of NATO's nuclear posture, as Pershing II missiles and cruise launchers were slated for deployment on German soil, ensuring that any nuclear exchange would begin and likely end there. German leaders found themselves trapped between irreconcilable imperatives, needing to demonstrate loyalty to the Atlantic Alliance to preserve security and political credibility, while facing a public increasingly unwilling to accept the premise that peace required readiness for immediate annihilation, a contradiction that destabilized the political center and fueled polarization. This dynamic was not confined to Germany, as governments in the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and the United Kingdom confronted similar pressures. each grappling with domestic opposition movements that framed the crisis not as a technical matter of deterrence, but as a moral failure of political imagination. The peace movements that emerged during this period were unprecedented in scale and composition, drawing support from across ideological lines and encompassing religious groups, labor unions, environmental activists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who had never before engaged in protest, united less by ideology than by the visceral fear that nuclear war had become not only possible, but probable. These movements rejected the Cold War, language of balance and parity, arguing instead that the introduction of faster, more accurate missiles destroyed the margin for error on which deterrence depended, and that shortening warning times transformed crisis management into a race against automated systems and human panic. Their arguments resonated precisely because they aligned with classified assessments that few officials were willing to acknowledge publicly, namely that escalation control in a European theater saturated with intermediate-range nuclear weapons was a fragile illusion. NATO governments responded with a mixture of reassurance and suppression, insisting that deployments were necessary to restore balance and compel arms control, while portraying opposition as naive, manipulated, or dangerously irresponsible, a stance that deepened mistrust and reinforced perceptions that security policy had become detached from democratic accountability. The Soviet Union actively sought to exploit this discontent, launching an extensive diplomatic and propaganda campaign aimed at portraying itself as a champion of peace and disarmament while casting NATO as the reckless escalator, even as it refused to dismantle the SS-20 force that had precipitated the crisis. This strategy was effective not because it convinced Europeans of Soviet benevolence, but because it amplified existing doubts about American intentions and alliance reliability, feeding narratives that Europe was being sacrificed to preserve U.S. strategic flexibility. Behind closed doors, Soviet leaders viewed the Euromissile Crisis through a dual lens, recognizing both the dangers of escalation and the opportunity to fracture NATO cohesion, calculating that sustained pressure could delay or derail deployments and lock in a favorable balance without firing a shot. At the same time, they confronted their own anxieties, as NATO's proposed systems threatened Soviet command and control in ways that undermined confidence in second strike capability, particularly the Pershing II, whose accuracy and speed were perceived as enabling decapitation strikes against leadership and communication nodes, intensifying fears that a crisis could evolve into a sudden, irreversible catastrophe. These fears drove a hardening of Soviet alert posture and planning, reinforcing worst-case assumptions and reducing tolerance for ambiguity, a process that mirrored developments within NATO and contributed to a feedback loop of mutual suspicion. The Euromissile Crisis thus evolved into a self-reinforcing system of insecurity, in which each side's efforts to restore stability produced countermeasures that increased instability, a classic example of the security dilemma magnified by nuclear technology. This system was sustained not only by military logic, but by institutional inertia, as bureaucracies, alliance commitments, and political reputations became invested in outcomes that were increasingly disconnected from public consent or strategic prudence. The role of the United States during this period was both central and paradoxical, as American policymakers viewed deployments as essential to maintaining credibility and preventing decoupling, yet underestimated the depth of European anxiety and the extent to which domestic legitimacy mattered in sustaining alliance cohesion. Washington's insistence that deployments were non-negotiable unless matched by Soviet concessions framed arms control as a test of resolve rather than a shared risk reduction exercise, narrowing diplomatic space and reinforcing zero-sum thinking. The election of new leadership in the United States intensified these dynamics, as rhetoric emphasizing strength, resolve, and moral clarity signaled a departure from the language of détente and reinforced Soviet fears that NATO sought not merely balance, but advantage. Within Europe, this rhetoric amplified existing concerns that decision-making had drifted too far from those who would bear the consequences, transforming the Euromissile Crisis into a referendum on sovereignty, representation, and the limits of alliance discipline. As deployment deadlines approached in the early 1980s, governments faced mounting pressure to either proceed and risk domestic instability or retreat and risk strategic isolation. A dilemma that exposed the fragility of Cold War arrangements that relied on public acquiescence without genuine consent. Mass demonstrations reached their peak, with millions marching across European capitals in scenes that contrasted sharply with official assurances of control and stability, revealing a growing gap between elite strategic discourse and popular experience. This gap mattered because it undermined the moral authority of deterrence, transforming nuclear weapons from abstract guarantors of peace into symbols of political failure and existential threat. Yet despite the scale of opposition, NATO governments ultimately moved forward with deployments, calculating that retreat would fracture the alliance and embolden Soviet pressure, a decision that marked a decisive moment in the crisis and set the stage for its most dangerous phase. As missiles were installed, alerts heightened, and the margin for miscalculation narrowed to its thinnest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Euromissile Crisis thus entered a period in which the theoretical risks long debated by strategists became operational realities, as Europe lived under a nuclear posture that compressed time, magnified fear, and placed unprecedented strain on the political systems tasked with managing it. As the first missiles were physically deployed across Europe in 1983, the Euromissile Crisis entered its most volatile and least forgiving phase, because what had once been a future contingency now became a permanent feature of the landscape, transforming deterrence from an abstract promise into an everyday condition governed by countdown clocks, alert procedures, and the knowledge that decision windows had shrunk to a matter of minutes. Pershing II launchers and ground-launched cruise missiles were installed under heavy security, often at night and amid protest, embedding nuclear weapons directly into civilian environments and making the possibility of annihilation inseparable from daily life, while Soviet intelligence monitored each movement with heightened sensitivity, interpreting deployment not as routine modernization, but as confirmation that NATO was prepared to fight and possibly win a limited nuclear war in Europe. Inside the Kremlin, fears intensified that the new balance favored the West, because the speed and precision of the Pershing II appeared to threaten Soviet leadership survivability, creating a perception that command and control systems could be decapitated before retaliation orders were issued, a fear that profoundly destabilized crisis calculations and encouraged worst-case assumptions. This perception mattered because deterrence relies not on actual intent but on belief, and Soviet belief increasingly held that NATO's posture reduced warning time to the point where hesitation equaled defeat, incentivizing rapid escalation in any ambiguous situation. NATO planners, for their part, insisted that deployments were purely defensive and aimed at restoring parity. Yet internal assessments acknowledged that escalation control in a European theater, saturated with intermediate-range nuclear weapons, was deeply uncertain, with war games repeatedly demonstrating how quickly conventional conflict slid into nuclear exchange once decision timelines collapsed. This mismatch between public reassurance and private doubt defined the crisis, as leaders projected confidence outward while managing fear inward, aware that any sign of hesitation could unravel alliance cohesion or invite pressure. The danger was compounded by the broader Cold War climate of the early 1980s, marked by hardened rhetoric, renewed arms racing, and a collapse of trust that made misinterpretation more likely, as each side filtered the other's actions through assumptions of hostility rather than caution. Intelligence failures and technical glitches during this period took on heightened significance because systems were now primed for rapid response, and ambiguous signals risked being interpreted as confirmation of imminent attack. Exercises, alerts, and routine military activity became sources of anxiety rather than reassurance, as both sides feared that training might be mistaken for preparation, and that preparation might trigger preemption. This atmosphere reached a peak during large-scale NATO exercises that simulated nuclear release under crisis conditions, reinforcing Soviet suspicions that the alliance was rehearsing real war under cover of routine activity. European publics, already skeptical, watched these developments with a sense of helplessness as political avenues for influence narrowed and security policy appeared increasingly insulated from democratic control, deepening alienation and mistrust. The psychological toll of this environment was profound, as nuclear war ceased to be a distant possibility and instead became an ambient threat shaping political debate, cultural expression, and personal anxiety, particularly among younger generations who questioned whether long-term planning made sense in a world that might not exist beyond the next crisis. Yet even as fear intensified, the logic of deterrence held, not because it was stable, but because both sides recognized that escalation would be irreversible, a recognition that paradoxically depended on systems that made accidental war more likely. This contradiction defined the Euromissile Crisis at its most dangerous point, a moment when stability rested on the flawless functioning of fallible human and technical systems under extraordinary pressure. The crisis thus revealed the central vulnerability of Cold War nuclear strategy, that it demanded perfect rationality in conditions designed to erode judgment, and flawless technology in environments where error was inevitable. By late 1983, Europe stood closer to nuclear catastrophe than at any point since 1962, not because of a single dramatic confrontation, but because of the cumulative effect of compressed time, mutual fear, and institutional momentum that left little room for pause or recalibration. The survival of this period owed less to strategic brilliance than to restraint exercised quietly and often invisibly, as individuals and institutions chose not to act on worst-case assumptions, even when doctrine encouraged them to do so. This fragile restraint, uncelebrated and largely unacknowledged, prevented the Euromissile Crisis from tipping into disaster. Yet it also underscored how narrowly catastrophe had been avoided and how little margin remained for error as the Cold War's nuclear machinery continued to operate at full speed. The gradual easing of the Euromissile Crisis did not come from a single breakthrough or dramatic reversal, but from the slow recognition on both sides that the system they had constructed was unsustainable, because the very measures taken to restore deterrence had instead produced a level of instability that threatened to escape political control, forcing leaders to confront the possibility that nuclear war could begin not through deliberate choice, but through miscalculation, fear, or procedural momentum. Within the Soviet Union, the experience of living under compressed warning times and persistent alert conditions intensified internal debate about the viability of existing doctrine, as military planners and political leaders alike struggled with the reality that the new European nuclear balance left little room for error and magnified the consequences of any misunderstanding. These concerns were sharpened by economic strain and political stagnation, which reduced tolerance for prolonged confrontation and highlighted the costs of maintaining parity through endless escalation. The emergence of new leadership in Moscow brought a willingness to reassess assumptions that had hardened over decades, not out of ideological conversion, but out of pragmatic recognition that the Cold War's nuclear trajectory had become self-destructive. In Washington, similar though less explicit anxieties took shape, as officials recognized that alliance cohesion was being eroded by public opposition, and that the legitimacy of deterrence depended on demonstrating a pathway away from perpetual brinkmanship. Arms control, long treated as a tactical instrument subordinate to strategic advantage, began to be reframed as a means of restoring stability rather than conceding weakness, a shift driven by the realization that intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe posed a uniquely destabilizing risk compared to intercontinental systems. Negotiations resumed under this altered context, marked by mistrust, but also by an unspoken understanding that failure carried unacceptable danger, as both sides sought mechanisms to remove the most time-critical weapons from the equation without appearing to retreat under pressure. The result was a diplomatic process that unfolded slowly and unevenly, constrained by domestic politics and alliance considerations, yet sustained by a shared awareness that the alternative was continued exposure to catastrophic risk. The eventual agreement to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons represented a departure from previous arms control efforts, which had focused on limits and ceilings rather than outright abolition, reflecting how profoundly the Euromissile Crisis had reshaped perceptions of acceptable risk. This outcome was not inevitable, nor was it driven solely by goodwill, but by exhaustion, fear, and the accumulation of evidence that the existing posture was untenable, a conclusion reinforced by intelligence assessments, simulations, and near misses that underscored how close the system had come to failure. For European societies, the prospect of arms reduction offered cautious relief, though tempered by skepticism born of years of protest and disregard, as many questioned whether the structures that had produced the crisis could truly be dismantled. Nonetheless, the removal of intermediate-range missiles altered the strategic landscape in ways that reduced immediate danger, lengthening decision timelines and restoring a measure of distance between political disagreement and existential threat. The Euromissile Crisis thus became a catalyst for rethinking nuclear strategy, demonstrating that stability required not only balance but restraint, transparency, and the deliberate reduction of systems that incentivized preemption. Its resolution did not end the Cold War, but it marked a turning point in how risk was managed, showing that negotiated rollback was possible even after escalation had reached extreme levels. This shift carried implications far beyond Europe, influencing subsequent arms control efforts and shaping a broader understanding that nuclear security could not rely indefinitely on the threat of mutual annihilation. Yet the crisis also left unresolved questions about democratic consent and accountability, as decisions of immense consequence had been made despite widespread opposition, raising enduring doubts about how security policy should be governed in societies that bear its risks. The memory of mass protest and near catastrophe lingered, serving as a reminder that deterrent strategies, however rational on paper, must ultimately be judged by their impact on human life and political legitimacy. In this sense, the easing of the Euromissile Crisis did not represent closure, but a pause in an ongoing struggle to reconcile security with democracy and power with responsibility, a struggle that would continue to shape the late Cold War and beyond. The long-term legacy of the Euromissile Crisis lies not in the missiles that were removed, but in the way the crisis exposed the fragility of Cold War stability and forced a reckoning with the assumption that nuclear deterrence could be indefinitely managed through ever more precise and time-compressed weapons. Because Europe's experience demonstrated that there was a threshold beyond which deterrence ceased to reassure and instead destabilized the very societies it was meant to protect. The crisis revealed that nuclear strategy was not merely a technical or military domain, but a profoundly political and social one. As public consent, alliance legitimacy, and democratic accountability became central variables in sustaining security arrangements, challenging the idea that nuclear policy could be insulated from popular scrutiny. For NATO, the Euromissile episode underscored both the resilience and the vulnerability of alliance structures, showing that cohesion could be preserved under intense pressure, but only at the cost of deep internal strain and lasting mistrust between governments and their citizens. This mistrust did not disappear with the signing of arms control agreements, but lingered as a reminder that decisions made in the name of security can alienate those they claim to defend, weakening the moral foundations of collective defense. Within the Soviet Union, the crisis accelerated a broader transformation in strategic thinking, reinforcing the view that security could no longer be achieved through unilateral advantage or intimidation, and that the pursuit of dominance in Europe risked provoking instability that threatened the survival of the system itself. This recognition contributed to a gradual shift toward doctrines emphasizing sufficiency, defensive postures, and political engagement, changes that would have been unthinkable during earlier phases of the Cold War. The Euromissile Crisis also reshaped global perceptions of nuclear weapons, strengthening movements that questioned not only specific deployments, but the legitimacy of nuclear deterrence as a whole, and influencing subsequent debates over disarmament, arms control, and the role of public opinion in security policy. Its impact extended into culture, education, and political discourse, embedding nuclear anxiety into a generation's worldview and shaping how societies understood risk, responsibility, and the limits of technological control. Yet the crisis also revealed the paradox of progress in nuclear politics, that meaningful reduction often required first experiencing the consequences of escalation, as only when systems approached failure did political will emerge to dismantle them. This pattern suggests that learning in the nuclear age has been reactive rather than preventive, driven by fear of catastrophe rather than foresight, a dynamic that raises troubling questions about whether future crises will be required to produce similar restraint. The Euromissile episode thus stands as both a warning and a precedent, illustrating that, while escalation can be reversed, the process is fraught, uncertain, and dependent on factors beyond rational calculation, including leadership, chance, and public pressure. It challenges the comforting narrative that deterrence naturally stabilizes relations, instead showing that stability must be actively maintained through constant reassessment and the willingness to abandon systems that undermine safety. For Europe, the crisis left an enduring imprint, reinforcing skepticism toward nuclear strategies that place the continent at the center of superpower rivalry, and shaping attitudes toward security that continue to influence policy long after the Cold War's end. In the broader Cold War story, the Euromissile Crisis occupies a critical place as the moment when the logic of nuclear brinkmanship was confronted not in theory, but in lived experience, forcing societies and leaders alike to acknowledge the human costs of abstract strategy. Its ultimate lesson is that peace sustained by weapons designed for instant destruction is inherently unstable, and that the preservation of security requires not only balance of power, but balance between power and restraint, between strategy and humanity. A lesson written not in treaties alone, but in the collective memory of a continent that briefly stood at the edge of irreversible catastrophe. The final meaning of the Euromissile Crisis emerges not from the treaties that followed, but from the realization that the Cold War nearly crossed a threshold where political control over nuclear weapons was no longer assured, because the crisis demonstrated how technological acceleration, alliance politics, and human fear could converge to create a system in which catastrophe might occur without deliberate intent, driven instead by compressed timelines, institutional momentum, and worst-case assumptions. Europe's experience during these years revealed that nuclear deterrence, often presented as a stable equilibrium, was in fact a brittle construct dependent on public consent, accurate perception, and restraint exercised under extreme pressure, conditions that are inherently difficult to sustain over time. The deployment of intermediate-range missiles transformed abstract strategic calculations into immediate existential threats for civilian populations, exposing a gap between elite discourse and lived reality that undermined the legitimacy of Cold War governance and forced a reckoning with the ethical dimensions of security policy. This reckoning did not produce consensus, but it did reshape debate, making it impossible to ignore the social and political costs of deterrence strategies that treated entire societies as acceptable risk. The crisis also highlighted the limits of alliance discipline, showing that cohesion could be preserved through resolve and force of will, but at the price of deep internal fracture that lingered long after the immediate danger had passed. For the Soviet Union, the Euromissile episode underscored the futility of seeking security through unilateral advantage, reinforcing the understanding that survivability required cooperation and risk reduction rather than escalation, a lesson that would inform the final phase of the Cold War. Yet this lesson was learned not through foresight, but through proximity to disaster, a pattern that raises enduring concerns about how future nuclear crises might unfold in a world where similar pressures and technologies persist. The removal of intermediate-range missiles reduced immediate danger, but it did not erase the underlying dynamics that produced the crisis, leaving unresolved questions about decision-making, automation, and the role of democratic consent in managing existential risk. In retrospect, the Euromissile Crisis stands as one of the Cold War's clearest warnings, showing that stability achieved through constant readiness for annihilation is inherently unstable, and that systems designed to deter war can themselves become sources of danger when they compress time and magnify fear. Its enduring legacy lies in the recognition that nuclear security cannot rely indefinitely on balance of terror, but must be grounded in restraint, transparency, and the willingness to dismantle mechanisms that incentivize preemption. Europe's passage through this crisis demonstrated both the resilience and the vulnerability of democratic societies under existential threat, revealing that survival depended not only on military strength, but on the capacity to question, protest, and ultimately change policies that placed humanity at unacceptable risk. In this sense, the Euromissile Crisis was not merely a chapter in Cold War history, but a stress test of the nuclear age itself, exposing how close the world came to losing control of its most destructive technologies, and leaving behind a sobering lesson that remains unresolved wherever nuclear weapons continue to shape global security.